Welcome back, everyone. We are up to lesson 18 of Unit 6. We have no new lesson notes, so we're going to get right into the examples. We're still talking about features of graphs of trig functions. So I have two sets of questions here. This first question off to the left is a multiple choice question. Here is the graph of a trigonometric function. Which equation has this graph? So you can see based on our choices that this is clearly a cosine graph. Okay, so remember with our cosine graph, it usually starts up top and then goes down and then back up. So it starts top, goes down, and then comes up. So the first thing I'm going to do with this is I'm first going to look at the midline. So let's remind ourselves again. The midline is the middle, a horizontal line that runs halfway between the high point and the low point. So it's a horizontal line that runs halfway between the high point and the low point. And notice the midline goes after the parentheses as a plus or minus. So here, my high point is at 1, and my low point is at 0.5. And actually I made a mistake. It looks like my high point is at 1.5 because 1 is here, 2 is here, the high point is in the middle, and my low points are at a half. So my low point's at a half, my high point's at 1.5. Halfway between that, if I change the color, is going to be at 1. So I know that the midline is at 1, which means when I write my equation, the plus 1 has to go after the parentheses. Okay. The second thing we want to look at is the amplitude. So the amplitude is the distance between the midline and the high or low point. So the midline, remember, is at 1. My high point is at 1.5, so that's a distance of a half. Same thing, the low point is at a half. The midline's at 1, so that distance is 1/2. So that means that my, my amplitude is going to be a half. So the amplitude, remember, goes before sine or cosine. So I'm going to put a half here. So that takes out choice A. So I'm down to 3 choices now. All right, so I've looked at the midline. I've looked at the amplitude. Now I'm going to look at the period. Okay. Now I'm going to look at the period. So the period, remember, is how long it takes to complete a full cycle. How long does it take to complete a full cycle? So to find the period, like it says here, find 2 consecutive max points or 2 consecutive min points and subtract the 2x values. So to figure out the period, so I have a min point at -1, and I have another min point at +1. So if I subtract those two, all right, my period is going to be 1 subtract -1, which is 2. So I have a period of 2. And I use the period, remember, to figure out what goes next to the x inside the parentheses. So remember my period, the formula for period, okay, is 2 pi divided by b, but I know that the period is 2. So to figure out what goes here, I have to solve this equation, 2 pi over b equals 2. So I can solve this by cross multiplying. So this was going to be 2 times b. So 2b equals 2 pi times 1, which is 2 pi. All right. And then I can divide both sides by 2, and notice this cancels and this cancels, and I get b equals pi. So this number that goes where that box is going to be pi. So if I put that together, I end up with an equation of 1/2 times cosine of pi x plus 1. And what matches up with that? It looks like choice C. So choice C is the answer to this first question here. Okay, let's take a look at the second question. Okay, number 1. Okay, find a trigonometric function f that has this graph. Explain your reasoning. So the first thing we're going to look at is we're going to first look at where the midline is. So notice my low point is here, my high point is here, so my midline is going to be at 3. Okay. Now, why is that important? Because I know that cosine, remember, usually starts up high and then goes down low and then back up high. Sine starts in the middle and then goes up to the high, down to the low, and then back up to the middle. Okay. If it's a normal sine graph, it would be 0 and then up to 1, down to -1, and then up to 0. So this is clearly going to be a sine graph because it starts in the middle. Okay. So this is going to be a sine graph. Okay. Now I already found the midline. The midline is at 3. So that, remember, the midline is the d value here. So because the midline is at +3, I'm going to put +3 after the parentheses. Okay. The next thing I'm going to look at is the amplitude. So I know that the midline is at 3, which is right here. And I'm looking for either this distance or this distance. Because remember, the amplitude is the distance between the midline and either the high or the low point. So if I look here, the midline's at 3, the high point's at 4, so that's a distance of 1. Same thing here. The low point's at 2, the midline's at 3, so that is a distance of 1. So that tells me that my amplitude is 1, which means the number that goes in front of sine, in this case, is going to be 1. Okay. The next thing I'm going to look at is the period. So remember, the period, again, is find 2 consecutive max or 2 consecutive min points and subtract the 2 x values. So if I look at, for example, here and here, 2 consecutive maximum points, okay, subtract the 2 x values, so the period in this case would be 5 pi over 4 minus pi over 4. So that's going to be equal to 4 pi over 4, or just pi. So my period is pi. So if my period is pi, then I could use that to figure out this b value right here. Okay, so I can use that to figure out the b value. So I know that period is equal to 2 pi over b. So I'm going to set that equal to pi. All right, and I'm going to do the same thing that I did over here. So I'll cross multiply, and I'll get b times pi, okay, equals 2 pi times 1, okay? And to solve for b, I would divide both sides by pi, and that cancels, and I would get a b value of 2, which means 2 is going to go right here. Okay, so the only other thing we would have to look at is there any horizontal shift? Well, we know that sine starts and ends in the middle. Okay, if I had moved this down here, okay, it would be like that if I hadn't done that. So the midline would be 0. It would start and end at 0. In this case, it's starting and ending at 3 because the midline was 3. So there's no horizontal shift. So my final equation is going to be sine of 2x plus 3. All right, I don't need to write the 1 times because 1 times anything is itself. Okay, so there's number 1, and let me rewrite that. Okay, so I know that the answer to number 1 again is sine of 2x plus 3. Okay, right? Yep. Let's look at number 2. Okay, the graph is translated right by pi over 2 so that it has a minimum value at 0, then stretched horizontally so its period is 3 times greater than the period of f. Find a trigonometric function of g that has this new graph. So what's changing is it's being translated to the right. So the amplitude is not changing. Okay. The amplitude is not changing and the midline is not changing. Okay. What's changing is I'm now instituting a horizontal shift. Okay. And I'm changing the period. So let's first look at the shift. So I know the midline is changing, so that plus 3 is going to stay there. So it's shifting right pi over 2. Okay. So let's go back and look at our notes from the previous lesson. Okay. Notice it's plus or minus c inside the parentheses. Okay. So, and we have to do the opposite. So notice if c is positive, then the horizontal shift is that many units to the left. Well, in this case, the horizontal shift was to the right. So c in this case, the opposite would have to be negative. So if I shifted pi over 2 to the right, then that means that value after the x inside the parentheses is going to be minus pi over 2. Okay, so that accounts for the horizontal shift of pi over 2. Okay, now we want the period. We're increasing the period by 3. Okay, so if we go back, we had said that our period from number 1 was pi. So my original period was pi. All right, I'm stretching it horizontally so that its new period is 3 times greater than the previous period. So the new period is going to be 3 times the old period. So 3 times pi. Okay? So when I look to find what goes here, okay, before it was 2, I now have to take 2 pi over b, because remember, that is the formula for period. All right, now instead of setting it equal to pi, like I did in number 1, I'm going to set it equal to 3 pi. So I'm going to set it equal to 3 pi. Okay, so I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to cross multiply. So this will give me 3 pi times b equals 2 pi times 1. So I'll divide both sides by 3 pi. On the left-hand side, the 3's cancel and the pi's cancel. So I'll get b. And on the right-hand side, the pi's will cancel. So I'll end up with b equals 2/3, which means that value that goes before the x inside the parentheses, instead of being 2 like it was before, is now going to be 2/3. So my new equation and my answer to number 2 is going to be sine of 2/3 x minus pi over 2 inside the parentheses plus 3 outside the parentheses. So that is my answer to number 2, and that is it for this lesson.